We're joined now from Bucharest by Dan McClory. He's the head of China for Boustead Securities, a financial advisory company focusing on investment banking. Dan, thanks for joining us today. Tell us, what's the biggest takeaway from the G20?
Thanks, Susan. Well, I think right here in Europe, there's a very interesting takeaway, and it's what a difference a year makes. Think back to Hangzhou. Think back to none of this drama, none of these security concerns, none of these protests and, post-summit goings-on. We've got several new leaders on the world scene, that's for sure, not the least of which is Donald Trump. So this has really emerged as a very eventful G20. Some calling it, of course, G19 plus one, and America first means America stands alone, but there's quite a few people that would differ with that point of view, considering the progress that was made from the U.S. side on trade, from the EU side on adhering to the Paris Accord.
Yeah, we'll talk about trade in a moment, but let's talk about the Paris Accord, because that pretty much dominated the headlines at the summit. In fact, President Trump having a very contentious conversation with France's president and really being isolated, much to his own doing.
Yeah, and I think President Trump is showing that it's okay to stand alone on certain issues. You don't have to vote as a bloc. Various countries, throughout the course of the G20 and its entire history, have done that from time to time. Angela Merkel made it a very contentious issue herself. And President Trump has said, I'm going to adhere to what I said before. The U.S. supports the environment, but we're not going to cave in just because we happen to all come together and they want to sign some post-Group of 20 protocol. I think he's been very firm and very committed to that. However, it's led to a wide range of discussions on all fronts, not the least of which is the rest of the countries that are staying the course.
Let's talk about President Xi and Mr. Trump, specifically talking about North Korea. Mr. Trump said, quote, "Something has to be done." President Xi has told Xinhuan that there has been progress made, but North Korea still is standing steadfast with its testing of these ballistic missiles. What progress was made on this point?
I think the biggest progress was that Trump was aware enough to not force a showdown. He understands and in some cases defers to Mr. Xi. This situation is sitting right on China's doorstep. He has pushed it as much as possible. He knows now that China is going to have to make its own decisions. He can exert as much positive influence, some would perhaps say pressure, as is necessary. But they've developed an interesting relationship since they came together at Mar-a-Lago. And I think if there's one thing about President Trump, he and Mr. Xi know how to not end up in a showdown with each other.
Why did this talk with Russian President Putin go on for 2 hours over schedule?
It's really interesting. I'm going to say, Susan, it's a little bit of more of the same. And that is, although President Trump's bluster has been legion and phenomenal, and his distractions and his tweets and everything else leading up to these meetings has been historic, to say the least, he understands that when two leaders come together, or several leaders for that matter, respect, listening to another point of view, attempting to forge a positive outcome from that relationship is paramount, again, despite the discourse, despite the bluster. So I think they had an extended conversation along those lines. And I think, quite frankly, they pushed some of those more contentious issues off to the side and said, what can we agree on? What can we develop a dialogue over? How can we forge a relationship? And that's what they did.
Dan McClory, thank you so much for joining us from Budapest.